Hi, everybody. Thank you all for joining us for this panel on U.S. arms sales reform and oversight. We're going to give folks another couple minutes to trickle in, and then we're going to get started. All right, it looks like we've reached kind of a critical mass. So I think we are going to go ahead and get started. So hello, everybody. It is a pleasure to have everybody here joining virtually. Welcome to U.S. Arms Sales Reform and Oversight in 2023 and beyond. It's a pleasure to be a part of the Forum on the Arms Trade's annual conference, particularly when joined by such distinguished panelists. I'm going to do a quick round of introductions before we get started. I'd first like to introduce Tess McEnery. Tess has dedicated her career to standing up for a U.S. foreign policy that advances democracy, protects civic space, and defends universal human rights. She currently is the executive director of the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMID, and has served 2 tours as a director for democracy and human rights at the White House National Security Council. Next, we are joined by Rachel Stoll. Rachel is director of the Stimson Center's Conventional Defense Program and also serves as vice president of research programs. Previously, Rachel was an associate fellow at Chatham House and a senior analyst at the Center for Defense Information. She has used her significant expertise on arms export treaties and policies as an expert with the United Nations and other international organizations. Last, but certainly not least, is Laura Lumpy, the Chief Executive Officer of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an action-oriented think tank researching and advocating for policies which emphasize military restraint and diplomatic engagement. Prior to leading Quincy, she was Advocacy Director for U.S. Foreign Policy at Open Societies Foundations and brings significant experience in field building and campaigning, including leading or working on a half-dozen humanitarian disarmament campaigns. So before we turn to our panelists for their more detailed analysis, I'd like to quickly situate us in some of the critical policy debates that are surrounding the U.S. arms trade right now. This week, as we all know, marks the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has put a spotlight on issues with U.S. policy and practice, particularly surrounding weapons tracing and end-use monitoring. And I think we can expect to hear about a little bit more about both of those from our panelists. The various vehicles for U.S. security assistance to Ukraine have contributed to a staggering amount of arms transfer packages authorized under the Biden administration. In 2022, congressional notifications for proposed arms sales reached $81 billion US, which was more than twice the $36 billion in arms offers made in 2021. These notifications included major defense equipment to partners with significant risk of use in violation of international humanitarian law, including Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Nigeria. It's with this context in mind that I'd like to ask Tess to share some of her thoughts. Tess, as someone with experience both serving in government and working closely with civil society, I wonder if you could orient us to both perspectives here. How does the executive approach these kinds of transfer decisions, and what factors do they consider or emphasize? On the other hand, how is the impact of these sales or transfers actually felt in the recipient countries, and what kind of impact does it have there? Tess, I'm going to turn over to you.
Thanks, Ari, so much, and also the distinguished panelists. I am way too pleased to not be on a manel today. So thanks to the Stimson Center for making sure that happened. I'm going to discuss, as Ari said, the impacts of the arms trade on human rights, democracy, governance, and conflict dynamics, especially in the Middle East region. I'll make the case that security assistance and arms transfers can fuel conflict, enable human rights abuses, and increase the ability of terrorist groups to recruit to their cause. And I want to do this by starting from something that I mentioned in a tweet promoting this event, because we all know all good policy and advocacy is done via tweet, which is this. I want to start from monitoring and evaluation because I'm a nerd and I love it. But I also think it's important to undertake this systematic act of examining the assumptions that drive why the US government provides security assistance, and then measuring the actual intended impact of US assistance. So I'm going to cover 3 assumptions that I think are often articulated by US administration officials and that I experienced in my time in the US government. So assumption 1, the US provides security assistance and sales to increase regional security and in turn US security, and makes trade-offs by not emphasizing human rights and democratic growth. In a recent op-ed, I put it pretty bluntly that there's very little evidence that we've actually achieved needed security guarantees in the region by undertaking this trade-off. We've spent decades providing arms transfers, mill-to-mill assistance, military basing, security-oriented diplomacy for results that have not been monitored or evaluated. And so the big question is, why should we continue to do the same thing and expect different results? Our security assistance has directly enabled military interventions by our Arab allies in Yemen and Libya that have extended or worsened the conflict. Our material and our arms have been directly used in raids carried out in Yemen. It's even been documented that they found their way into the hands of our adversaries in this conflict. So this instability also has an extra bonus of building resentment and grievances across the region against the United States for its perceived or real role in these conflicts. Our security assistance has also not yet isolated Iran or built a sort of promised regional coalition to deter Iran in the region, which is an articulated priority for this administration. And decades of massive traditional security assistance and arms transfers hasn't, in fact, yet built the capacity of our Arab partners and allied militaries to defend themselves without our help. And so the current national security strategy and a recently articulated Biden doctrine for the Middle East region continue to identify robust military support and cooperation, including via the Abraham Accords, as a key tenet of our relationship in this region, despite this lack of results. Specifically, I'd also like to point out our assistance to Egypt, which has remained largely unexamined in the decades after the Camp David Accords. Now we're faced with one of the most repressive regimes in Egypt's history, whose military counter-terrorist campaigns in the northern Sinai has brutally targeted civilians and only increased the grievances used to recruit people into terrorist groups, which I mentioned earlier. Al-Sisi regime also routinely contradicts US interests, including in Sudan and Russia. So again, where is the systematic monitoring and evaluation that shows us what we're getting for our money in places like Egypt? And is it worth the trade-off of ignoring human rights and governance? That's assumption one about security. Assumption two, to secure our oil and energy interests for the American people, we simply need to do business with autocrats and continue to incentivize cooperation with security assistance. As we all know, most recently, the Biden administration engaged with the Saudis to encourage them to pump more oil to offset the impact of sanctions on Russia, as well as strengthen an alliance against Iran. In fact, shortly after the president's visit to Riyadh last summer, the Pentagon announced yet more offers of missile defense systems to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And yet, as we saw as part of the September OPEC Plus decision, Saudi, in fact, reduced oil output. So we get again to my favorite topic of monitoring and evaluation to show us how, in fact, our security concessions are driving economic deals for the American people. So we have our security assumption and our economic assumption. And the third assumption I want to tackle is that the US must continue to supply arms to our Middle Eastern partners to prevent them from turning to China and Russia for cooperation. And yet, nearly all US allies in the region have turned to other suppliers, whether it's Europe or Russia, sometimes China, to secure arms. They're looking for the best deal, simply put, for security cooperation. And in fact, for China specifically, the autocratic state that the US's national security strategy identifies as our chief competitor, they're engaging more heavily in economic cooperation and deal making in the MENA region. So getting back to monitoring and evaluation, has the US examined its assumptions that Middle Eastern leaders are in fact making trade-offs between US security assistance and Chinese economic cooperation? In the case of Russia, the US has noted that our Gulf allies have continued to vote with us against Russia at the UN as a symbol of their solidarity. Yet most of these same allies have aided and abetted Russia's financing of the war in Ukraine. They've helped oligarchs evade sanctions and launder money. The UAE, it takes top honors as one of the world's leading money launderers. It feeds the destabilizing behavior of the IRGC, and it's graylisted by the Financial Action Task Force for enabling foreign terrorist financing. So overall, US arms sales have become not only a source of personal enrichment for elites in the Middle East, but they've also fostered entire kleptocratic and patronage-based networks that directly undermine our US interests, including in relation to competitors that we've defined as China and Russia. So given those three assumptions that the US government usually examines economic security and global sort of power competition, I think we can see that US arms sales don't, in fact, provide the influence that they promise. They can further destabilize entire regions. They can increase the risk instead of decrease the risk of the United States being drawn into conflicts. They can contribute to massive human rights violations, including through the use of our own tools. And it can foster resentment across the region that is counterproductive to US national security interests. So I would say that the overall theme across the US government, across administrations, that countering our rivals, countering the autocracy of our rivals requires tolerating it in our Middle Eastern partners is really false. And so my call to action is that we need to treat democracy and human rights in the Middle East as, in fact, a vital national security interest, not just a value that's, in fact, essential for the region's stability and security and not a threat to it. Thanks. Back to you, Ari.
Thanks so much, Tess. I know you've digged into sort of a lot of different themes that I am hoping we're going to be able to explore more in the Q&A. I know I definitely have a couple questions for you. I'll also note that the point that you raised on if we don't sell, someone else will is an argument that we see a lot, and it's kind of, it's a poorly reasoned one. And to learn more about why, you can attend the upcoming Stimson Center event, which is going to be taking place on March 9th from 9:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So I will note that if you're interested in those types of arguments, definitely do check out that event. I now want to turn it back stateside for some ideas on how we might address kind of these arms sales policies on our end before they go to partners. So we are now halfway through Biden's term. Rachel, could you give us an overview of what Biden's term has looked like to date for arms control issues? What have been some points of strength and what are some causes for concern?
Thanks, Ari, and thanks to everyone joining us. And it's really an honor to be on this esteemed panel of women, very smart women on these topics, and to engage in this conversation. As someone who has a program that's dedicated to reducing risk and minimizing harm associated with the global arms trade, I'm sure it will come as no surprise that we're sort of tracking where the administration has gone and where it looks to be going in the next 2 years, particularly with regards to their approach to security cooperation. And I think it's safe to say that a lot of us are feeling a little underwhelmed at the moment at the administration's progress in reforming sort of the entire arms transfer, military assistance, and defense cooperation enterprise. So I think part of that disappointment, to be fair, is based on the high expectations that the Biden administration itself set during the campaign and in its early days in office. Because if you recall, there were many promises from the Biden team that it would work to ensure America's approach to security cooperation elevated human rights, accountability, and transparency. And I think we all had a lot of optimism in the community that things would look very different than they did under the Trump administration. And I do want to say, I think, and I'll mention them, there are some notable improvements and changes. I think the administration's record to date really falls short of the goals that they set for themselves, much less sort of what we as civil society were expecting and looking at. I think the biggest one, and I think my fellow panelists will probably agree, that the continued absence of a revised conventional arms transfer policy or CAP policy has been especially disappointing. And we've heard that the new policy is imminent, but we've really been waiting far too long for this important guidance. So for those in the audience who are unfamiliar about why this is such an essential policy, it's really an executive branch directive that guides the entire government approach to the conventional arms trade. And it was rewritten during the Trump administration to sort of elevate perceived economic benefits of arms sales at the expense of foreign policy, national security, and human rights concerns. And I think that approach really helped justify many arms sales that really defied American values, and also had massive public and even congressional opposition. And it's why I think a revised cap policy became one of the main priorities for those of us in the transfer control community and the human rights community. And we're so eager to see that policy released, because in the absence, even with the rhetoric that we've seen, that is the guiding policy of the administration. We've been assured that the whole of government is operating under the spirit of what will soon be revealed as the official policy, but the delay itself, I think, is problematic, because it makes it harder for us as civil society to hold the administration to account for their on-paper commitments to human rights and accountability. It gives the administration some questionable wiggle room for its arms transfer approaches. It complicates efforts to advocate for specific and practical measures to improve arms transfer oversight and responsibility. And more importantly, or actually, I don't know if it's more importantly, but as importantly, it sends a really unfortunate signal about the level of priority a more responsible arms trade occupies in the administration's agenda. So even when the policy is imminently released, I think much valuable time will have been lost that really leaves a very truncated window of opportunity for the administration to make good on some of the commitments that they made early on in both in their campaign and administration. Now, hopefully those will all be represented in the policy, but of course we have to see. In the sort of absence of this new cap policy, the US approach to arms transfers has sometimes felt a little untethered and left questions around the inconsistencies in commitments to transparency, human rights, and oversight. And despite the rhetoric, as Tess just laid out, the Biden administration has continued to engage in security cooperation with a number of questionable partners, including some who Biden as candidate and as president valued or promised to keep at arm's length during his administration. So I think we want to make sure that we're holding the administration to account to live up to the rhetoric that it has laid out itself. I think the lack of an arms transfer policy has also been an excuse to allow the administration to remain silent vis-a-vis things like the Arms Trade Treaty. The Arms Trade Treaty, or the ATT, is the first legally binding global agreement to regulate international arms transfers. Under President Trump, the United States took both the unfortunate and bizarre step of unsigning, you can't really unsign, but unsigning the treaty, which really reflected a fundamental misrepresentation of what that instrument was trying to do, but also was a significant blow, I think, to international arms control efforts and the American reputation as a responsible arms transfer actor. There's no barrier to the president, either legal or political, to rescind President Trump's letter and say the United States is, committed to the object and purpose of the treaty. But the administration has insisted that they can't take such steps until there's a new conventional arms transfer policy and a review. And I think it's certainly an unfortunate step that the White House has taken, and undercuts its ability to say it's a champion of multilateralism and international cooperation. I think on a lot of other issues as well, the Biden administration has sort of pursued a middling approach that some of them are good and some of them are not so good in terms of reform. So I personally will commend the administration for a new anti-personnel landmine policy that rescinded a much more permissive directive that the Trump administration implemented, but it didn't go far enough. It basically got us back to where we were at the end of the Obama administration, but didn't include any steps to rescind the carve out for their use in South Korea or make more concrete commitments to destroying America's existing stock of anti-personnel mines, or laying out a path for the US to join the mine ban treaty. And so I think that's been disappointing to some. Similarly, on cluster munitions, we're also seeing the administration remain relatively silent. Of course, the US hasn't used cluster munitions since 2009 or exported them since 2015, but the US still hasn't joined the Convention on Cluster Munitions. And I think given what we know is a severe and long-lasting threat these sorts of weapons pose to non-combatants, the Biden administration should lay down a path and a timetable to joining the conversation. To be sure, there are other areas where the administration has made notable progress, but a lot of those steps have had caveats and exemptions. And I think the lack of sort of holistic reforms has really defied the scale of what we're seeing in terms of the scope of America's massive security cooperation enterprise. And I think all of this is a little bit more concerning in light of what we've seen in the last year. And certainly some of that is attributable to the war in Ukraine and the massive security cooperation effort that has undergone there. But foreign military notifications for proposed arms sales grew by more than 127% between 2021 and 2022. And I think now we're seeing that the war in Ukraine is sort of galvanizing global demand, not just demand in Ukraine for conventional arms. And so I think we're going to see that number continue to grow. And then just lastly, we're talking about sort of we're at the mid-year point or the midpoint of the Biden administration. But before we know it, the administration is going to be in full-on election mode. The attention that's given to this issue is really going to diminish. And with uncertainty about how a different White House might approach these issues, I think it's really important that this administration works now to cement those changes that they promised during the campaign and build upon the successes that they have had. I will say the administration is saying all the right things. I would just love them to follow up with those quote unquote right actions.
Thank you, Rachel. That is a super helpful overview. And it sounds like it's going to be really critical kind of for advocates moving forward to be pressuring the Biden administration to institutionalize this really strong rhetoric. So now that we've gotten sort of a sense of how the administration is thinking and through and approaching these issues, as well as how arms transfers are felt in their recipient countries, I'd like to turn now to Laura for an overview of the current geopolitical conditions that make arms sales reform so pressing. So the mainstream defense establishment is increasingly focusing on so-called great power competition. Meanwhile, analysts and advocates on both the right and left have noted that these plans rely on flawed framings of the United States as the indispensable nation. Could you take us through some of the political and security dynamics which are influencing arms export policy right now? What are some challenges and opportunities that you and your colleagues at Quincy are seeing for restraint-focused arms transfer policies?
Sure. Thanks, Ari, and a pleasure to be with you and Tess and Rachel. Thanks so much for having me. Well, as Tess noted, first of all, during the 2020 campaign, President Biden promised that the United States would stop checking its values at the door. Whether U.S. arms sales are driven by values, I think is debatable whether that's ever been the case going back to Carter Doctrine days. We at the Quincy would at a minimum like to see U.S. arms sales not violate our direct interests and think that the arms sales should be made principally only in support of direct vital national U.S. interests. So one area that has been talked about clearly is the way that the quest for global military dominance, that is primacy, leads to all kinds of deal making in support of U.S. arms sales to facilitate access to bases, facilities, airstrips, et cetera, that will allow for U.S. military intervention or exertion of introduction of force anytime, anywhere on short notice. And that's clearly been that quest for dominance and primacy has really been a handmaiden of U.S. arms sales policy, certainly since the 1970s. We have currently, as your listeners no doubt know, about 750 or so military bases or access points around the world. That is a staggering disproportion compared to, for Russia, maybe 24 in the near abroad and Middle East. For China, maybe a couple, one in Djibouti and perhaps a couple being negotiated in its own region. So this quest to have and maintain U.S. military dominance and fast access really goes just hand in hand with arms sales decision making, some of which is value-based, much of which is not, in the sense of, we're willing to look away from questions of autocracy or human rights when it's in the service of that perceived need for access. So we are fundamentally challenging the idea that U.S. global military dominance and hegemony is making the American people or our partners in regions of the world safer. My colleague Bill Hartung did a paper earlier this year, also as I think Tess noted, and Rachel, many times U.S. arms sales, of course, are not only being shipped in despite governance or human rights problems, but also actively fueling conflict dynamics. My colleague Bill Hartung did a paper last fall where he noted that roughly 2/3 of all current conflicts, 34 out of 46 active conflicts in the world, involve one or more parties armed by the United States. In some cases, these are modest wars. In others, these are quite our arms sales are playing quite a significant role in fueling and sustaining the conflict. 15 of these conflicts, he noted, received over 50 million or more worth of U.S. arms between 2017 and 2021. So this problem, this idea that our arms sales are going to help promote global stability by providing us with access to this base structure or other access points that are then going to help us, rule the world, as it were, has been shown to be flawed, both in terms of short-sightedness of disavowing our stated values, but then also this primary interest of stability and peace. As we've seen in the war in Yemen, U.S. arms supply has also dragged the United States into conflicts. In 2019, the Congress decided that the role of intelligence, arms supply, mid-air refueling, and other support to U.S. weapon systems was significant enough to warrant Congress, to necessitate that Congress pass a war power resolution to say that we are in effect in a party to this war through our largely arms supply and support relationship with the Saudi Arabia and the UAE. As you know, the Biden administration ran on a platform of reining that back, as we've talked about, and after a failure to do so, Senator Bernie Sanders pledged to reintroduce a war powers resolution just late last year. He pulled that ultimately, but it was on the same logic that this ongoing continued supply continues to make us a party to the conflict. And similarly, I think there are concerns, of course, about what level of military assistance and supply in the war in Ukraine. At what point do we cross from supporting totally legitimate defense by Ukraine into becoming a party into the war ourselves? So there is a slippery slope between these questions of when the supply certainly first puts us in moral hazard in some of the questions and ways that Tess described earlier, but then secondly, when it actually potentially drags us into a state of active combat. I think I will let it stop there for now, but lots more to discuss.
Yeah, thank you, Laura, for highlighting some of those really helpful dynamics in both sort of the U.S. history and ongoing posture that have really made more significant reforms, I think, really necessary. I think we've seen that just piecemeal changes around the edges, administrative changes, are not going to be enough, and that some sort of more wholesale reform efforts are necessary. And I will say, fortunately, I think there is a growing movement of folks in Congress who would agree with that. Last year, we saw the introduction of the National Security Powers Act in the Senate and the National Security Rights and Accountability Act in the House, which included what I think was a really exciting opportunity for reform. I'm wondering, could you talk a little bit about what that mechanism is and what it looks like?
Sure. Yeah, we at Quincy are very excited about that law as well, and it's got three parts, one of which deals with arms exports. All three of the parts relate to wars or conflict and seek to reform and reinvigorate Congress's constitutional powers to decide when the United States does engage in war. And as I said, there's this relationship or pathway between the arms supply and becoming de facto a body, a combatant or a participant in a war. So one of the things that the National Security Powers Act does would make a reform to the Arms Export Control Act that was made necessary by a Supreme Court decision a long time ago in the 1980s that basically invalidated or made it practically impossible for the Arms Export Control Act to allow Congress to block a sale. I should back up and say, probably most of your listeners know that the Arms Export Control Act is the body of law that governs arms sales and also military aid decisions. It allows for Congress to block a sale when a sale to a NATO member country is made. Congress has 15 days to introduce a resolution and pass law in effect in both houses that would block that sale. For non-NATO member countries, it's a 30-day window. In either case, that is an extremely short period of time around which to introduce and build necessary support to even get the resolution out of committee. What the National Security Powers Act, and for this reason, I should say, for this reason, Congress has never succeeded in blocking an arms sale. They came the closest in 2019 around bomber sale to Saudi Arabia. It was related to the thing I just mentioned about the War Powers Act in 2019. Congress also decided to block a sale that President Trump put forward. They actually mustered the majority in both chambers to block that sale. But then, as could be expected, President Trump vetoed that sale, then requiring Congress had to come to the extraordinary hurdle of 2/3 majority in both chambers to override that veto. That is simply not practically possible in today's highly divided, highly partisan government. It was extraordinary that they managed to get a majority of both chambers together to block that sale. And in fact, that, as I said, was the first time that it had ever happened. The only other time Congress came anywhere near to doing that was back in 1981, also around an arms sale to Saudi Arabia. In that case, it was an AWACS, airborne warning and control system deal that was highly opposed by AIPAC, which rallied a significant level of support against the deal, but did not ultimately manage to block it. What this reform would do, and why I think this is the most important single reform that can be undertaken for anyone who wants to be able to actually try and curtail executive branch activities around arms sales, is it would flip the dynamic. So instead of causing Congress to take action to block a sale, it would say for a sale to go forward, Congress must take action. And the law is written in a way, as you and Rachel have noted, there are many arms sales notifications happening all the time. The law can be written in a way so that the approvals are packaged together. But what this would do is when Congress was of a mind to block a sale, instead of passing law, it would simply not pass a law. And what that means is there's nothing for the executive branch to veto. So in the situation like we had in 2019, where it was a very rare case, again, first time since the law was passed, that Congress has mustered that majority, in that if the law had been flipped in the way we're proposing here, then there would have been nothing for President Trump to have vetoed. The sale would simply have been blocked because Congress did not take action in support of it. So I feel that this reform, this is going to be heavy lift. This is going to get at some bureaucratic interests, both within the executive branch and on Capitol Hill. Industry is certainly going to oppose it because they would prefer to have the status quo where the sales can be counted on to go through without meaningful ability by Congress to block them. But if we as a community of people for human rights, democracy, good governance in the US, or other reasons, do want our Congress to have the ability to intervene on these questions that, again, do impact on war making, then I think this is absolutely necessary requirement to flip it in this way.
Thank you, Laura. That is super helpful. I will also note that you can find an explainer of the provisions that Laura has laid out in the link in the chat. I think Flip the Script is really one of the strongest opportunities that we have to reassert congressional oversight and Congress's constitutional role in war-making authorities, which I can definitely include arms transfers as part of. So I think this is a really valuable initiative that folks would do well to sort of be tracking. And hopefully we're going to see some traction on that in the House or Senate this year. So now that we've sort of talked a little bit more about what Congress might be able to do to reclaim that authority, I'm going to turn it back to Rachel quickly and ask, what are some recommendations you might have for the Biden administration? What are some changes, some concrete changes the administration can make to actually implement and institutionalize this strong human rights rhetoric that we've seen?
So I think it'll come as no surprise. The first thing that sort of frames all of this is to get that CAT policy out immediately. And I know it's imminent. But I think the sooner that can happen and the more public the US government is in sort of messaging that, sharing it, explaining how it fills the objectives that this administration has laid out with regards to arms transfers, I think the better. I think in terms of, and I should say that whatever that policy actually says, I really, really, really hope it reflects a policy of restraint and of improved attention to human rights. I think those are two of the fundamental changes that we'll all be looking for. In terms of sort of bigger, more practical changes, I think across the board, we need more transparency in the US security cooperation enterprise. And I think the last year in the sort of rush to get things to Ukraine quickly, rightfully, I'm not disagreeing with that necessity, but I think we have to remember that transparency is really the lifeblood of reform and acts as an essential guardrail against impunity or short-sighted decision-making. I mean, Laura just laid out very clearly why sort of the framing has to change. And I think we have to think about transparency in the same way. We've seen how transparency facilitates cooperation between civil society, the public, industry, and the US government on these really thorny issues. And we need to have that dialogue to keep responding to threats and new approaches. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen is the arms trade itself remains very opaque and leaves huge questions about the nature of America's foreign policy and security engagement. I think on an even more practical level, I think having more detailed reporting and data on Defense Department-led building partner capacity programs, sort of what Tess was talking about at the beginning, making arms sales notifications for direct commercial sales more public, consider some sort of reporting for arms sales that fall below mandated threshold notification values. I know that's really wonky for many in our audience, but I think all of those sort of steps that demonstrate sort of this is where the US is engaging with partners in this way in a security focused approach is really helpful. I think there's also a missed opportunity by this administration to really demonstrate its commitment to multilateralism and differentiate itself from the previous administration by continually keeping at arm's length the various international conventional arms control instruments. I'm not suggesting that they haven't been more vocal in some of the non-conventional agreements, but I think instruments that help ensure a more responsible arms trade when you are absent the #1 arms exporter in the world, that sends a very clear message. And so that's not just the Arms Trade Treaty, but it's the Cluster Munitions Convention, the Landmine Treaty, et cetera. And then lastly, our event tomorrow on Ukraine will also be talking about this. In terms of programmatic reforms, I'd really like to have a serious conversation about holistic changes to our end-use monitoring regime. I think for one thing, the term end-use monitoring is really a misnomer because it does not, in fact, monitor use. But because of its misleading title, I think the impression is we have this really useful insurance policy in our back pocket to make sure that we can protect ourselves from some risky arms transfer decisions. And I think under our current paradigm, state and defense-led end-use monitoring are geared towards protecting sensitive technologies and really don't have a lot of built-in measures for human rights and civilian protection imperatives. And those are only sort of applied to a very narrow set of cases. And I think, are poor safeguards against irresponsible use of American defense equipment. So I'd like to see a more robust conversation in that realm as well.
Thank you, Rachel. And I'll note that we've gotten a couple questions sent in on end-use monitoring. So hopefully at the end, we will have some time to circle back to that. And I will also really encourage for anyone who's interested in US security assistance to Ukraine or some of the pitfalls that we've seen in our poorly named end-use monitoring programs in general, I really encourage folks to attend the event that's in the chat right now. That's the Stimson Center event tomorrow, February 22nd, and that's going to be from 9:30 to 11, fully virtual. So that's a really good opportunity for folks to learn more and check that out. Tess, I want to kind of bring it back to you because you highlighted a lot of different issues that we see US security cooperation drive and engender, issues with corruption, issues with governance. I'm wondering if you can take us through a little bit, sort of why some of these issues have persisted and how we might be able to think about addressing them, either from an executive or a congressional lens.
Thanks, Ari. And I will also thank Laura and Rachel for, in the best way possible, stealing so many of my good ideas, talking about the cluster munition, landmine, arm transfer agreements, getting serious with end-use monitoring, flipping the script on Congressional Roll. Like, those are, to answer your question directly, Ari, really huge starting points. So I'll be, I think, hopefully a little vaguer on a larger framework for this. I think overall, any US administration should just attach more stringent human rights and anti-corruption conditions to security assistance and arms sales. That's obviously not the larger fish we want to fry with sort of Congress's role in this, but I think I often like to say that transformational change can only be achieved by really annoying, relentless, incremental change, and just the incremental efforts in specific countries and contexts for advocates to sort of relentlessly engage the US government and other governments about, for lack of a better term, I don't love the term, conditionality on these arms sales and assistance, and arguing how it is really fundamentally against US national interest, I think is really important. I think it's important to also acknowledge the small steps, for example, the Biden administration took with withholding some military aid from Egypt, for example, 2 years in a row. But the lesson there is that it needs to be consistently applied over time. And so having one-offs where decisions about conditionality are made sort of with different criteria and different determinations of what are human rights improvements or conditions is not helpful. There needs to actually be a robust sort of bureaucratic system in place in the United States government, but all governments, to really articulate these standards and hold all of our allies and partners, no matter who they are, if they're democratic, autocratic, to a basic set of bare minimum standards. I will also say that a lot of political realists argue that this sort of tactic doesn't change behavior. A lot of the things I mentioned earlier, which I think are red herrings and not necessarily substantiated, of our partners will turn to Russia, they'll turn to China, they'll do all of this other behavior, that has not been substantiated by fact or ample evidence. I think what we have seen is that by moving past a brief trial period of conditionality, we have seen results, even if they're small and incremental. And that, I think, is a vote of confidence for continuing down this path, even though it's not ideal. I will also say that the US government often says that their foreign military sales process is the most transparent, accountable, and efficient process in the world. And I will say something unpopular, which is that's probably true, but it doesn't mean it's great. And I think we should actually take action and inspiration from the fact that the United States is likely to have one of the best regimes in the world, and it still falls so far short of where it should be. So what are concrete improvements we can introduce to make these sales more transparent and accountable, to actually live up to the argument the US government often makes that our arms sales, like countries are attracted to them precisely because they are so high standard. I think that's not necessarily an argument the US government has successfully made, and they should do better. I also want to raise the issue of corruption. We've mentioned it a few times, but I think we need to really seriously assess through the National Strategy on Countering Corruption that the US government issued, through multiple commitments through the Summit for Democracy, about a true steps on how to tackle corruption and the way it fuels instability, to move past just this focus on Russia and China that we've had a lot in the countering corruption strategy, to focus on security governance, and look at how our arms transfers and capacity building in defense establishments across the world can be centered on transparent and accountable standards and anti-corruption. I will note that the State Department actually, after the countering corruption strategy was released and after the first Summit for Democracy, did actually release a sort of fact sheet of sorts of how they were going to implement countering corruption standards, which are a full section in the strategy, in arms sales and cooperation. And so the US government has acknowledged that that is a central way to move forward and identifies a few sort of mild to moderate ways that they'll pursue improvements. But, you know, openly acknowledges that there are long-term challenges to doing this. And on that note, the last thing I'll say, which is probably the most or the least exciting piece for a lot of us who are focused on, you know, big sort of transformational change, is that simply enhancing, improving training and education of like the workforce at the State Department, Department of Defense, who oversee these security assistance and arms transfers, to do better vetting, to actually fulfill statutory requirements for end use monitoring or other things. Like some of it is legislative, some of it is executive action. A lot of it could simply be, and I say simply with irony, is really better developed training and implementation of the actual jobs that people in the US government have already, and empowering them to make sort of more fulsome, well-informed decisions.
Thank you, Tess. That's really helpful. And I think that actually segues us really nicely into a question that we actually got for you. So this is from John from New Mexico. So you've talked a lot about governance, which I think is great. And it's been an issue that has definitely been sort of at the forefront of discussion for the Biden administration recently. I'm curious, how do you think the US government should factor governance concerns into arms sales decisions? And more importantly, perhaps, what role can Congress play in ensuring governance issues are prioritized?
That's a great question. And I might also defer to my panelists on some of the details, especially the congressional part. But I would say that, you know, that conditionality point I got to of governance, this is sort of going on a bit of a tangent, but if people had been following the World Bank's fragility framework and a few things like that, they started to build in governance and conflict prevention conditions into releasing loans. And I think it's that concept of arms sales or assistance and building in those hatches of, are you meeting certain governance conditions, that would be really important. I think that sometimes people get scared about the big D democracy word, but there are core principles that I would argue are democratic, which is inclusion, transparency, accountability, participation and oversight by the people in the country of how arms sales and transfers are used and sort of implemented. That should be considered. I think, again, it gets back to my other point of making the case, especially to both the executive and legislative branch, of how this is in the interest of the United States government, that actual governance conditions or criteria would make the provision of assistance and the security of the United States more effective.
Thank you. That's super helpful. Laura, I think you had something to add.
Yeah, just a small thing. One very narrow form of both conditionality and governance that Congress has a really direct role to play on is over ensuring implementation of something called the Leahy Law, which says, at a minimum, if the U.S. government is not able, for vested other reasons, to follow its values base around human rights and anti-corruption, at a minimum, the U.S. should provide no direct assistance, arms sales or military aid, to units in a foreign country that have that the State Department itself has reason to believe have engaged in gross crimes, human rights crimes. And so that's been standing law since 1999, I think. It's been expanded on a little bit over the years. While Senator Leahy was in office, he and his staff worked to safeguard and to try and build that out, still very tentatively implemented. But I would say that's a very direct way that Congress can and should engage with, again, a narrowly writ. If we can't do that, if we can't ensure that we are not providing assistance to foreign units that we ourselves believe have engaged in gross corruption or human rights violations, then I think we should hang it up. So that would be one area where Congress could continue to engage directly.
That's a really helpful flag. And I'll also note that because of states' overly narrow interpretation of the word assistance, we do not currently apply Leahy vetting to arms sales. We only apply it to things that the United States is paying for. So I will also note that Senator Leahy himself has been very clear that this goes against his intent and the original way that the bill was written and its scope. And so one, kind of quick fix for Congress might be just ensuring that the Leahy laws are applied as they were written and as they were intended to be written, and as their author has gone on the record repeatedly over 20 years to say they should be applied. I have a last question coming in about end use monitoring, which I think is something that is very exciting for a lot of us. So for those of you who don't know, end use monitoring is a really I'm just going to give a quick background because I think the term is misleading. So a lot of folks in Congress have a false sense of security about the level of tracking that we have for United States arms. So statutorily, the US government is required to trace, and track certain advanced technologies to ensure that they are not transferred without US consent. In practice, however, these measures are very weak and they don't actually track how and where these arms are used. So if a US, say, bullet, to use or a missile for a totally hypothetical example, strikes a school bus in Yemen, there is no way that we monitor or track or that informs future decisions. So a question that's come in from Sheridan from Dallas for Rachel Stoll, if you could make one change to the end use monitoring regime, what would it be?
Well, I mean, very clearly, I would monitor use, right? Like it's very fundamental. But I think, it is not enough to pick a very small percentage of all of the transfers that are supplied both at the State Department or licensed by the State Department or authorized by the Defense Department, and say that you're looking comprehensively. And our end use monitoring in the past has been literally sending security assistance officers to the location and counting them, making sure that the weapons that we transferred are where we said they were going to be and that the numbers match sort of it's a very oversimplified description, but we're not actually looking at where and how they are used. And I think at a fundamental level, we need to really examine, are the weapons that the United States is providing, are they having both, fulfilling the intended purpose or objective and not doing harm, right? And that's sort of at the very base level, we demand sort of ourselves monitoring and evaluation of programs and policies at all, in all sectors. And so we really should be looking to see, are the weapons that the United States are transferring are not contributing to unintended consequences? Are they not exacerbating conflicts? Are they not being diverted beyond sort of the, what we thought would happen? And so I think, it seems very obvious, but I think monitoring use is really the first thing I would do with an end use monitoring program. And I should say there isn't just one end use monitoring program. It's not like every weapon is examined by, a small cadre of individuals, right? There are different programs depending on if those weapons were transferred under State Department authorities, Defense Department authorities, or even Commerce Department authorities.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. We need to put the use back into end use monitoring. And I'll note that this brief that is now in the chat from myself and Rachel actually gives an overview of the current statutory regimes and notes a few ways that we could improve that, including requiring open source intelligent and IC information to feed into the end use monitoring process. So I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So I think we are going to end up calling it here. But I do want to note that there are several really exciting events coming up at the Stimson Center that relate to these topics. So once again, tomorrow at 9:30, you can come and see more information about how Ukraine security assistance has proceeded and what some of the opportunities for end-use monitoring and tracking that have emerged there. I think that we're seeing some really exciting innovations in the Ukraine space that could potentially be applied really usefully to other risky arms sales contexts. And then we'll also note that on March 9th from 9:30 to 11 is the If We Don't Sell event, which I know all three panelists really alluded to this idea that, if we don't sell somebody a weapon, they're just going to go get it from China or Russia. And that argument's flawed for a lot of reasons. So what we've done is we've engaged substantively with some of that literature on dependency theory and some of the geostrategic implications of what would or does happen when those choices get made. So I would, again, that's on March 9th, really encourage folks, if they are interested, to check that out. Otherwise, thank you guys so much for coming. And I'll say that our emails, et cetera, or at least mine are open for any further questions that we didn't get a chance to address. Thank you all for coming and looking forward to seeing everybody back for more events at the Stimson Center shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the second panel of today, where we're going to be talking about trade and investment in weapons, technology, and services used in repression. When Jeff Abramson and I began talking about this panel, I suggested a title along the lines of arms exports that you don't think of as actual weapons that can still get you killed anyway. But thankfully, Jeff is a much, much better wordsmith than I am. But that is indeed what we're going to be talking about today. Some of what might be referred to as the cats and dogs of arms exports that we don't usually think about as exports. And I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to how those look before I introduce our panelists and the show that we'll be putting on today. One of the type of weapons that you don't think of usually as weapons that have come into the public consciousness lately would be Elon Musk's Starlink communication system. This came into public consciousness after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where he offered up to great aplomb that he would be offering up to turn on the terminals and provide that support to Ukraine as it fought off the invasion by a Russo-fascist army coming at them. He then was not so well appreciated when he threatened to take away a lot of the funding for Starlink for Ukraine, when the Ukrainian government told Elon Musk what he could do with his suggestion regarding negotiations with Russia. And then he's been kind of quite a bit in the news lately as he discusses what exactly it is that Russia is, or where Ukraine can use his Starlink system, mainly when it comes to its actions against Russia in the Russian area itself. And so it really highlights arms exports as it comes to individuals, to private companies overall, and the fact that things like communications gear is increasingly considered a weapon of war. Plenty of military analysts have noted how communications gear, particularly Starlink, is totally changing the way we do war, enabling the capabilities of things like Uber for artillery, where because there are secure communications nationwide, all the way up to tactical units, individuals in the front line can call back for artillery support, allowing much more efficiency with that artillery, particularly when every artillery round is absolutely needed and necessary. Another one that's entered the public consciousness is cyber weapons. The Pegasus papers, and especially the two-part documentary on Frontline, describing what these weapons are, how they're used to surveil journalists and human rights defenders, is a particularly chilling example. In at least one case, a journalist's phone in Mexico was hacked with the Pegasus software sold by Israeli arms exporter NSO Group. And while correlation is not causation, it was shortly after that hacking into the journalist's phone that journalist was killed while he was conducting investigations into government corruption. Likewise, Jamal Khashoggi's relatives had Pegasus on their phone when he was killed. At least one of his wives and his fiance at the time have been found that their phones were hacked. What does the software do? Well, it allows one who can hack into that phone to be able to track wherever an individual goes at any time. It allows one to see whatever they type on their screen. So if one is typing an encrypted message on Signal, the person on the other end of the hacking can actually read it. They can turn on the phone. They can turn on the camera. It becomes a form of Uber bug. The surveillance can also be used to prevent any protests or reforms and further enable government repression. Governments can scan, for example, for any signs of protest and break them up at the early stages when there's a vaguely critical tweet or a vaguely critical Facebook post, long before there can actually be nonviolent protest against regimes. Not only does this allow the criminal and the corrupt authoritarian regimes to maintain power, but by cracking down on protests before there are actually protests, they can give a veneer of stability, of being a good place for economic development, of being a great place to live in a very Potemkin sort of way. Or governments can hire private security contractors and mercenaries, another area that people don't often think of as falling under the arms exports, but which they do. This has become most evidenced with Wagner Group, as they've been propping up oppressive regimes in Central African Republic, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Syria, among others. They offer a trade in return for cash and natural resource contracts for diamonds, gold, oil, whatever the case may be. They'll provide a one-stop shop. They'll provide bodyguards to protect the unpopular leader. They'll be offered to capture and protect the mining sites. They'll provide media and propaganda and help set up AstroTurf, if you will, fake local propaganda outlets. And they'll engage in assassination, torture, ethnic cleansing, or whatever is needed to keep a repressive government in power and prevent economic reform. And yet, private military security companies and mercenaries are vastly underregulated in the United States and around the world. And finally, if all else fails, if the surveillance isn't working, if cracking down on protests before they even start, if the use of private military security companies isn't enough for you, there's always, unfortunately, good old-fashioned torture that can be used, and another set of weapons that is desperately underregulated. So on that morbid topic, it is my pleasure today to introduce our three panelists that are going to be talking to us today. I'll be first talking to Colby Goodman. He's a senior researcher at Transparency International's Defense and Security Program, working on their US-oriented research and advocacy work. Second, we'll be talking to Sam Jones, who's the president of the Heartland Initiative, where he's going to be discussing the difficulties that ethical investors face when they try to not invest in weapons of repression in countries overseas. And then finally, we'll be talking to Anna Crow. She's the associate director of the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School and an expert on the export of weapons of torture. The way these will play out today is each of my speakers will be given a few minutes to discuss their particular topic. I will use moderator's prerogative to ask a couple questions, and then we will open it up to the audience. A reminder that this is indeed under Chatham House rules. So with that, Colby, may I hand the floor to you?
Thanks so much, Jody, and thanks to Jeff and the Forum on the Arms Trade for inviting me. And I'm feeling slightly self-conscious that there's men on this panel, given the last panel, but yeah. So what I'd like to do is just give you a little bit of overview of who the players are now on sort of in the PMSC industry and where they're sort of operating, and then a little bit later, maybe we can get to this discussion about challenges. So, well, despite the drawdown of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the private military and security industry is expected to double in the next 10 years. So private market research companies are projecting that PMSC annual sales are likely to grow from 224 billion in 2020 to over 457 billion in 2030. Not a big surprise. US PMSCs account for the largest share of the market, estimated around 20% in 2020, and perhaps will only grow to about 21% in 2030. Ukraine, of course, has really brought the issue back again into the spotlight. The issue of PMSCs, not only or most especially with the Wagner Group, but also volunteers and US PMSCs such as the Mozart Group that are operating there. And if you would have asked me in September, like who was paying attention to PMSC issues the most, which capital in the United States, I would have said Hollywood, with so many films coming out. But I think in terms of US PMSCs, I think times are changing. There was an investigation out by the Washington Post and the Project on Government Oversight at the end of last year, which identified something like 500 waivers that DoD gave over the past 10 years, well, from 2010 to 2020, for former retired or former US military officials working to 50 countries, most prominently UAE, but really all over the world, and highlighting some of the challenges there. Outside of the US, the other major major PMSC industries are UK, Germany, Australia, and then more increasingly China and India. In fact, China is projected to grow the fastest of all the sort of PMSC industries with their Belt and Road initiative. And we're also seeing Turkey and sort of homegrown PMSCs from Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. And I think just Judy, you've talked a lot about the Wagner Group, and I'll just highlight a little bit that it's sort of a definition to define group, because on the one hand, it's often referred to as sort of a private mercenary, but it might be better described as a paramilitary arm of the Russia, or are a special branch of the Russian government because it also engages in brand and marketing, forced mobilization, and shell company creation and hiding. So I'll stop there maybe, and then we can come back and talk about some of the concerns of the industry. So.
All right. Thank you so much for that overview, Colby. Sam, may I turn it over to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jody, and thanks to Jeff and Forum on Arms Trade as well. So just to frame this a little bit, because I definitely feel like a fish out of water in this group. Heartland Initiative does not have expertise in the weapons industry or in military contracting, and in fact, what we do across industries, whether it's weapons, extractives, renewables, et cetera, is take civil society organization, leading technical experts, think tanks, human rights organizations, et cetera, and translate their cutting edge research and analysis into decision useful information for socially responsible investors, whether those are faith-based, pension funds, church-based pension funds in the US, or large SRI investors in Europe. And to kind of frame the why we focus on investors is that they typically are one of the key stakeholders and potential change agents missing from this conversation. They occupy a rather unique role when it comes to within the business and human rights community, in that they are shareholders in a particular company, and sometimes those are weapons companies or those companies that produce dual use items, products, services that we're going to be discussing. But B, they also have their own ethical investment guidelines. And so we work with them essentially to engage companies to advance, better corporate practice. We work with them to exclude or divest from companies who are unable or unwilling to mitigate their human rights harms, which is typically the case when you're talking about the weapons industry, but to basically try and engage in systemic risk analysis and policy reform. And it's worth pointing out that although they may not be at the table, for the organizations gathered here, your research and analysis does make it into their weapons exclusionary criteria. The majority of the investors we work with have exclusionary weapons criteria. In the US, churches tend to be the leaders, and they have essentially taken findings from PACs, from Forum on the Arms Trade, from other organizations, and integrated it into their theological framework around how they choose to make divestment decisions. A lot of those weapons screens, though, it's worth pointing out, and we'll get into more later, tend to be stuck in either the Cold War or the mid-90s. So you've got nuclear, biological, chemical, anti-personnel landmines, cluster munitions, sort of the controversial weapons. And in Europe, it tends to be less theology driven and more driven by international treaties covering certain weapons, certain controversial weapons. So the real challenge for us that we're going to be discussing is how do you get investors in North America and Europe to reconceptualize their idea or to modernize their weapon screens to account for whether that is surveillance technologies or other type of cyber weapons, lethal autonomous weapon systems, or any number of other weapon systems that exact a really heavy toll in human life, has been borne out from Ukraine to Ethiopia to Yemen to Myanmar. So I'll stop there and look forward to the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you for that overview. And Anna, may I turn it over to you, last but not least?
Thank you, Jody. So I think the topic that I'm going to talk a little bit about is the regulation of the trade in law enforcement equipment. So that trade is currently unregulated at the international level. There are some countries that have national controls that place trade restrictions on certain types of law enforcement equipment. And actually the United States is one of those countries, but it's somewhat exceptional in having national controls, and not only on a small number of weapons and devices and equipment, but on quite an array of law enforcement equipment. The reality is, though, that very few countries nationally actively regulate this space, or if they do, it's in quite a fragmented way. And at the regional level, you have the most significant instrument being the EU, the European Union anti-torture regulation. So under that regulation, all EU member states regulate the trade in law enforcement equipment, and that regulation also covers goods used in the death penalty. However, aside from that regulation and a few other regional instruments that are voluntary, there are no international level standards. And there are also no clear statistics on the trade or its magnitude. There's very little transparency in terms of the actual international trade itself. But it is very clear that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of companies manufacturing law enforcement equipment, participating in trade fairs, advertising equipment for sale. So it does exist as a significant industry. And it's clear, of course, that law enforcement equipment is used in torture. So although in theory you can imagine anything at all being used for torture, there is specialized law enforcement equipment that's produced that is specifically designed for the purposes of torture. And of course, other law enforcement equipment that's designed for regular law enforcement functions is regularly used for torture. I don't think you need to look much further than the use of a taser and pepper spray on Tyree Nichols just a few weeks ago to understand that point. Maybe just full disclosure, I am part of a network of NGOs that are pushing for a treaty for new international law in this area to fill this gap in international law. And that's led by Amnesty International, the Centre for Victims of Torture, and the Omega Research Foundation, along with a group that met in London just at the end of January to talk about this sort of area of common concern. And I guess also to clarify, when I'm talking about law enforcement equipment, I'm referring to any equipment, weapons or devices that relate to the use of force by law enforcement officials, except firearms, because there's already the Arms Trade Treaty in the international space to regulate firearms and related equipment. And I think it's also, as everyone knows, international regulation of trade isn't going to end human rights abuses, and in this case would not end torture, but would send an important signal and create an important tool to further stigmatize torture and help reduce risk. So it would sort of have a torture-free trade treaty would have a very similar rationale to the human rights-based controls that the Arms Trade Treaty mandates. So over the last few years in particular, the relationship between law enforcement equipment and torture and other ill treatment has become much better understood and scrutinized, although, as I said, there's still a lot of gaps in our knowledge of the trade itself. And you've seen emerging in the discourse a distinction between two types of equipment. The first category is what we call inherently abusive equipment. And the second category is all other law enforcement equipment. So inherently abusive equipment, as the name suggests, is equipment that's used in law enforcement that has no practical use other than for the purpose of torture or other ill treatment. And I should say other ill treatment refers to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. It's just a shorthand way of saying that rather long phrase. So examples of this type of equipment would be things like thumb cuffs, body-worn electric shock weapons, spike batons, and spike shields. And there's already existing language in the annual or now biennial torture resolution of the General Assembly that encourages states to ban this type of equipment. And my perspective and the perspective of the group that is arguing for a treaty is that this type of equipment, this inherently abusive equipment, ought to be absolutely banned. So a ban on production, trade, acquisition, and associated activities. So it would be in nature quite similar to the humanitarian disarmament treaties like the Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and absolutely banning inherently abusive equipment. The second type is all other law enforcement equipment, which we say should be subject to trade controls. So this would be things like handcuffs and batons and certain types of chemical irritants and kinetic projectiles. And for the last nearly 20 years, you've seen successive special rapporteurs on torture and others argue for human rights safeguards to prevent trade in this equipment when there's a clear risk that it could be used for torture or other ill treatment. And you've seen the development of regional instruments. I mentioned the EU anti-torture regulation. And then more recently, there's been a resolution of the African Commission and a 2021 Council of Europe recommendation. So there is some movement on the regional level. But again, there's no international instrument that sets out this requirement for risk assessment. So essentially, yeah, there's no treaty rule that requires states to regulate this trade at the moment. You can make this argument under international law that there's already something of an obligation here to regulate the trade because states have an obligation to prohibit and prevent torture, but there's no international body or mechanism that's saying that this is required. So the challenge we see is that there is this unregulated trade going on, and no clear understanding of where equipment is coming from and going to, and really not a level of scrutiny appropriate for the harm that this equipment can cause in the world. So that's sort of my, I guess, opening statement there. But look forward to your comments, and thanks also to the Forum on the Arms Trade for organising this.
Fantastic. That was a quite, well, scary rundown of various weapons of torture and so forth in a very public event. I'm now going to go through questions, and I'll go basically in order that I introduced you all earlier. And I see we're starting to get questions into the chat. So this is a great time to think about your questions and put them in while you still have a couple minutes. So Colby, I'm going to take your challenge that you offered up earlier, where you said you were going to speak about the challenges of regulating PMSCs and mercenaries, and throw that back to you. Can you please discuss some of that on the international front and the US front?
Great, thank you. Well, I'll also add a little bit, just sort of like the general sort of human concerns that we have as well. So Sam said something that I sort of forgot to mention, that a lot of PMSC's organizations are so large that they're being traded on the stock market, right? So there are huge, and they have, some of them have sales of $10 billion, annual sales of $10 billion a year, and have more than 50 subsidiaries around the world. Maybe Sam, you could incorporate that too. In terms of sort of like the general concerns, I think, we're seeing the same level of the same types of concerns that we've seen with PMSCs, when the Blackwater first raised attention, right? So there's outside of sort of Iraq and Afghanistan, there have been US PMSCs or PMSCs that have strengthened the coercive power of special forces that have been involved in human rights violations or corrupt actions. Some of them more and more are getting blurring the line between providing military advice and actually engaging in direct combat activities. Of course, some of them are, Jody, as you were talking about earlier, getting more involved in, so this is getting into the new stuff, more involved in surveillance. Traditionally, there's been concerns about PMSCs, or the S part, the security part, and getting involved in torture. And I think, getting close to what Anna was talking about, I think there are still ongoing concerns about that. And one of the sort of the challenges and the motivation for using PMSCs is it can offer a sort of distance or a political deniability that's not available, or is not, as easy if regular security forces are there. So as a sort of extra level of complication for accountability. So surveillance, as we've seen, in the news quite a bit, is a growing sort of area of PMSCs, and it's less regulated in terms of the services. One of the concerns that a lot of people have raised is surveillance activities. There are former U.S. intelligence officers that have worked with dark matter in the UAE that ended up spying on UAE political dissidents, and those that sort of against the UAE, including American citizens. And I think that the other things that we're paying more and more attention to is sort of the revolving door of former U.S. generals and admirals and intelligence officials that are working for foreign governments and not necessarily getting the level of scrutiny that companies will get. And they sort of add a different level of concern. Some of those just about the level of transparency on when these generals are advocating on U.S. foreign policy or U.S. defense policy, to what extent they're actually disclosing that they're working for a foreign government. There have also been concerns that those admirals and generals' ties with companies and how they sort of then advocate for certain purchases of equipment that can maybe not be the most beneficial for that country in the long term. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Colby. Can you talk a little bit about U.S. regulation in particular? The U.S. Put a lot of new laws in after 2009, after hearings on Blackwater and so forth. But there's a lot of big loopholes that Transparency International has written about when it comes to who U.S. persons can actually work for and when they need a license and when they don't. Can you mention that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. And I suppose I should mention this report that we put out in September. It's called Hidden Costs, U.S. Private Military and Security Companies and their risks of corruption and conflict. I'm of course giving brief comments here, but there's a lot more detail in there. I mean, it's a little bit like the U.S. Mexico border from the U.S. side. There's so many things that can go through that don't get oversight. So basically, the U.S. doesn't specifically regulate PMSCs. They regulate some small number of services, so military training and sort of weapon maintenance. But any types of support that in terms of personal or physical protection, a lot of intelligence services, police training, that's all gone. And perhaps the most surprising is that direct combat activities are not regulated. So in theory, someone could support or be a part of direct combat operations abroad and not have to get a license from the State Department. There are also sort of concerns about just the things they do regulate, concerns about the types of scrutiny that they're using. So there's not as deep level of conflict of interest. They're not investigating the sort of all the different layers of the subcontractors, which, you know, so many of the US PMSCs hire locals, and there's so many tiers that can be very challenging. And then, you know, I think that more recent investigations have highlighted that the waiver process that the Defense Department uses is really is not catching up to the challenges that are there. So there's sort of limited repercussions for failing to seek a waiver. And then a lot of, you know, they've found that a lot of people are engaging in services and not actually getting the proper approval. And if I'll just add one more sort of, you know, it's some of these same things that we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan are starting to happen in Ukraine. So there's been a recent accusation by one of the founders of the Mozart Group for inflating salaries and engaging in or trying to engage in military training without getting the proper State Department approval. So.
All right, thank you, Colby. And let me turn it over to the investor side of the house, Sam. Can you tell us about, you know, Colby's told us about some of the challenges in regulating PMSCs. Can you tell us about some of the difficulties you have in providing the information that your investors are looking for? And if you could make one change that would make your job so much easier, whether it be legislative, regulatory, or otherwise, what would that change be?
Oh, wow. Okay. So first, let's start with the sort of theoretical and practical challenges that investors are facing. So I mentioned before that you already have existing weapons exclusionary criteria around different controversial weapons. And one of the reasons why, apart from, you know, constituencies in the churches, constituencies of the investment firms advocating for this, you had excellent analysis around those controversial weapons that were fundamentally incompatible with international humanitarian law. And so it laid out the case. So whether that was grafting it in with their theological concerns around peacemaking, or the UN or on the treaty bodies around certain types of weapons, the theoretical foundation was there for those. And it simply, I'm not saying it doesn't exist at all, but there is precious little in terms of fundamental incompatibility around lethal autonomous weapon systems, although that piece is changing. There's even less around fundamental incompatibility with international and humanitarian human rights law as it relates to different types of surveillance technologies. So part of it is the absence of the research and analysis that could be basically integrated into exclusionary criteria as sort of the policy component. Then there are the practical challenges. Unlike your controversial weapons or conventional weapons list from SIPRI, from Defense One, you simply don't have that for your lethal autonomous weapon systems, in certain cases, your surveillance technologies. You have anecdotal research about certain types of surveillance tech, for example, where there have been, calls for global bans or moratoriums, whether that's around spyware or around certain types of biometric surveillance, but it's not standardized. There's research and analysis that's coming out of that's articulated in the Talon manual. There's, of course, the Wassenaar arrangement, which produces different publications. There are other groups, including some gathered here today, that talk about sort of some of the implications around IHL or IHRL and certain types of dual use weapons. But there's nothing really digestible for investors out there. And we tend, and that's one of our central challenges. To your question, what would be sort of the one, I'm going to give you several, ideas that I'll go, first of all, to state painfully obvious, the regulation is really behind the 8 ball on this when it comes to surveillance technologies, or to Anna's point around torture device, torture equipment. And so one thing that there has to be regulatory progress, and in order for there to be regulatory progress, there needs to be greater coordination between government and civil society around what constitutes surveillance technologies, what are the typologies, and which ones are which ones, again, are fundamentally incompatible with international humanitarian law, and make that as a starting point for enhanced regulation. The second piece, one thing that would make my life a lot easier, is a sort of a theoretical framework around the types of dual use technologies, and other types of modern weapons that are simply incompatible with humanitarian law, that we could then take and essentially adapt investor policies in North America and Europe to make those consistent across the board, not just with controversial weapons, but with these new types of weapons. And I think, this is starting to happen. The coup in Myanmar, and the use of the Israeli company Cognite spyware, Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, of course, the surveillance state that was erected there, with a lot of multinationals being implicated in the report by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. And then finally, in Ukraine, for example, the indispensability of semiconductors in Russian and Iranian weapons systems that were used in violation of international humanitarian law, and the research that's being done by Royal United Services Institute and Conflict Armament Research. So there is growing appetite for this kind of research and application, but I think there needs to be certain additions to the ecosystem of regulation and information. And NSO Group has been pointed to several times. It's a great case study where, sort of the triangulation of regulatory enforcement, so blacklisting by Department of Commerce, strategic litigation by Apple and WhatsApp, and incredible sort of investigative journalism and research, the Pegasus Project, came together in a great way that really demonstrated both, most importantly, the human rights risks associated with spyware, but also the potentially material risks for companies and their shareholders when you have regulatory penalty, litigation costs, terrible brand damage. it really painted a picture. And I will say that after that precedent was set, when we're having conversations with investors, if the term spyware comes up, that has tainted the industry, that particular example. So the question becomes, how do you do research and analysis that and coordinate efforts that achieve similar effects for other publicly traded companies, and particularly at-risk industries, whether it's Colby and PMNCs or ANA in torture weapons. So.
Thank you. And I'm going to give a couple final questions to Anna here, and then we'll open up. We already have 3 questions in the chat I've seen. But Anna, before we move forward, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned the 2 broad types of weapons for law enforcement that you look at, the inherently abusive equipment and then that all others category. Can you talk a little bit about what an international treaty regarding these would look like? And then what are the biggest challenges you face to getting this international treaty pushed through?
Thanks, Jody. Yeah, I think maybe just to sort of take a step back, because we use the language of torture and ill treatment and assume that everyone knows what that means. But when people think of torture, they think of a dingy police cell or a prison somewhere. But sort of understandings of torture have evolved over the years to appreciate that it can take place in public settings. It can occur on the streets during protest, during something like a forced eviction. And what we're really talking about here when it comes to other ill treatment and torture is excessive use of force by law enforcement. So the overall idea here is to have the trade in law enforcement equipment regulated to help reduce that risk of excessive use of force, to reduce risks of torture and other ill treatment. So we hope that a treaty would, as I say, absolutely prohibit the inherently abusive category of equipment and then create trade controls that have a risk assessment embedded within them for other law enforcement equipment. And I think there has been some careful effort on the part of civil society to craft what those 2 lists look like. And there might be debates about, which falls into one category or the other. So there's some boundary issues to be determined, but that these are sort of definable categories and definable pieces of equipment that are being marketed, that are being sold internationally. It's not a sort of mystery what this might regulate. The scope is very clear when you have some knowledge of the industry itself. So there's already a process that started within the UN General Assembly that we hope will lead to a treaty. So in 2019, there was a General Assembly resolution that established a group of governmental experts. And for those of you who work in the disarmament space, you're probably screaming because you know that maybe means years of deliberation. But in this case, it reported, this expert group reported last year, and they sort of agreed with the idea that there should be common international standards, but they sort of suggested that there could either be a treaty or that there could be guidance. And I think from a civil society perspective and just thinking about the effectiveness of instruments, we're very strongly, or I am personally in the organizations that I work with, very strongly in favor of a treaty as something that creates concrete international rules that allows for the sort of institutionalization of norms and a community of practice to develop around how this equipment is controlled internationally. I think a treaty would also bring with it really important things like reporting mechanisms. So you'd start to see transparency, the opaqueness of the industry would become, less opaque as there was reporting on exports and on imports, and the opportunity for civil society and others to monitor what transfers are taking place, what countries are doing to implement, to create national legislation. Because I'll say, I have a research project at the moment where we're trying to understand national measures in a range of different countries, and it's extremely challenging because even as I said, it's just very fragmented national regulation. So just to create even like model laws that countries could be looking at adopting would be a huge step forward, and I think could have this tangible impact of preventing transfers when there is this clear risk of torture, and states could be relying on the knowledge that they have from the arms trade context of how to carry out some of those assessments, although they're not done perfectly, obviously. There is this knowledge of how to embed human rights factors within licensing considerations.
And can you tell us a little bit about the specific challenges you face with this treaty going forward? Are there particular blockages or particular states?
Yes. Sorry, yes, your question. So there are already 63 states they're part of something called the Alliance for Torture-Free Trade, that have been supportive of this idea of moving forward with a UN process. So I think the challenge, to be honest, is one of building on that existing grouping, which is led by the EU, Mongolia, and Argentina, and also making it an issue of concern. So it's not just sort of sitting on the back burner of the UN agenda for the next 20 years, but something that that different states feel compelled to work on internationally. And I think particularly with the emphasis on police violence that's come into international discourse, there is this opportunity to have that conversation and to see this as part of one of the ways in which the international community can respond to that phenomenon, which isn't specific to one particular country, but a sort of shared challenge around the world. So I personally feel that they're optimistic, although there are obviously challenges in building a political coalition, but and getting actual resources dedicated to moving forward in international treaty negotiation.
Thank you. And starting with some of our audience questions, building to you, Anna, because Phil has asked a question related to what you were already talking about, which is aligning the cases of torture and human rights violations with these sort of new technologies compared to traditional arms transfers. Can there be sort of I'm not entirely sure I understand all of Philip's question, but is there a way to use kind of a carrot and stick approach to encourage, I think he's probably talking about companies who are exporting these, and sort of carrot stick approach to do so in a responsible manner?
Yeah, so I think at the moment it's fair to say that companies that are in this space aren't necessarily engaged in the business and human rights discourse. So they would see it as the responsibility of governments to make decisions on export, on whether an export is allowed or not. Obviously, there has to be a sort of parallel track of trying to reinforce that there are business and human rights guidance and obligations here that companies should be thinking about, but that the state is sort of the main mechanism through which we'd see effective regulation and transfers not moving ahead. You know, the best estimate I've seen is that there's, and this is from the Omega Research Foundation, is that there's maybe around 500 companies that are manufacturing inherently abusive equipment. So to continue to manufacture that is inherently, like, you can't be complying with human rights in any meaningful sense if you're producing things that serve the purpose of torture specifically. So that's a sort of category in and of itself. But I think the rest of the industry, there's still work to be done to sort of talk to law enforcement, companies manufacturing law enforcement equipment, to help them be sort of partners in this rather than feeling that it's like an attack on their industry. There's obviously a recognition that there is a legitimate trade in this space in that second category of equipment.
All right, thank you. And turning now to you, Colby, and Luciano had a question about the fact that there is no common definition of what constitutes private military security companies. Not in his question, but of course there is a definition of mercenaries, but it's very easy definition to get around that. Can you talk a little bit about the definitional ambiguity of what constitutes a PMSC and a mercenary organization?
Great, thanks, Jody, and thanks for the question. I mean, I think the issue of definition on PMSCs has plagued this sort of regulation of the industry for a long time. Some of the quick challenges is there's some groups that want to focus on the security elements, and then there's some groups that want to focus more on the military elements. I do think there's a UN, or actually in April we're likely to have perhaps there's going to be final negotiations on a new framework on PMSCs, and I think the definition in there is pretty good. It's relatively broad. It incorporates cyber warfare, surveillance stuff, and I think and there's, I think, a lot of momentum and support for that treaty. We'd like to see the U.S. supporting it a little bit more. So I think a lot of the definitions have just focused on specific activities, and we've sort of taken the approach to just like look at what's the purpose. So that's a roundabout way of me saying I think actually the UN definition is pretty good. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to now turn it over to Sam for a question. One is, well, if you had an audience with a CEO of Primes as someone who works on investor issues, what would you like to impart to them? And then tying that also to the same question that I had asked Anna, which is, where is some of that carrot and stick approach that that Phil had asked about earlier when it comes to human rights violations compared to these new technologies?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second one first. And to Anna's point, we face a lot of challenges in terms of surveillance tech. So for example, on your typical spyware company is not publicly traded, right? So they tend to be funded by private equity, Cellebrite being one of the rare exceptions to this. And so due to that fact, they're not as susceptible, obviously, to shareholder advocacy, shareholder pressure, and trying to hold them accountable. But when you expand beyond spyware, and whether you're getting into semiconductor manufacturers, whether you're getting into platforms like those manufactured by NVIDIA that are involved in autonomous policing in UAE, for example, these are companies that have flown under the radar for a long time. So they tend to be widely held by socially responsible investors and tend to have brought in external consultants to develop global human rights policy. So there is more opportunity for a carrot and stick approach there. And so this kind of gets us to your first question about talking to a CEO. What we tend to focus on is if we can get them to engage, what are those specific elements of a human rights due diligence process that could help them limit or prevent or end their human rights risk exposures that are associated with their technologies. So we start talking about things like, how do you integrate human rights into know your customer due diligence process? So, sanctioned individuals and entities in Russia did not become rights violating at the point of sanctioning. There were, civil society did a great job of documenting that. So how do you do things like that? What are better monitoring systems for when these technologies are deployed, especially in conflict affected and high risk areas? What are contractual human rights safeguards that you can, as a company, put into place if you decide to enter emerging markets where there is higher risk? So a lot of our work is really moving away from sort of the UNGP aligned human rights policies at the 30,000 foot level and getting into the granular operational details with these companies around, where their technologies are being deployed and how they assess that, who their technologies are being deployed by, and assess that, and then what specific contractual, operational, technological safeguards can be put into place based on the specific type of those technologies. So hope I answered that.
Thank you. And Colby, I wanted to ask a similar question to you. Of course, Transparency in National Defense and Security actually does rank defense companies, including those involved in PMSC and mercenary activities, or PMSC activities, of course, none of them claim to be mercenaries. But if you had an audience with those CEOs of those prime contractors, what would you like to try to impart to them?
Oh, I was afraid you were going to ask me this question. Before I answer that question, I know there's some State Department folks on the line here. I mean, I think the State Department is recognizing the gaps in regulation on PMSCs, and I think we expect them, or at least they've said publicly that a new regulation coming out on defense services, which sort of regulate the types of things that I mentioned, military training and weapons maintenance, and probably combat activities is coming out. So I think they're increasingly trying to recognize this, and I think the White House too is increasingly open to doing that. But on the CEOs, so yes, we do. Transparency International Defense and Security does put out a defense company index, and in our report, actually, we sort of analyze some of the gaps of the largest companies that engage in PMSC services, and some of the ones that are concerning is sort of their vetting of agents they work with in the country, or the the entities that the private security entities that they hire in country. Just, I mean, general transparency is a huge problem. So many of these companies are, are run by so the sort of medium-sized one are run by former military, and they're not used to being transparent. And so, I mean, those are just some of the big ones, yeah, that I would want to raise.
And on a similar question to you, if you had the chance to sit down with the head of NSA or with the head of some of these law enforcement organization suppliers, what would you like to impart to them?
I think for the ones that are manufacturing the equipment that's in that second category, there is an opportunity here to sort of get ahead of things and be really thinking consciously about the places that they're sending equipment to, and be more transparent about where things are going and why they've what their human rights due diligence policy looks like, just to have one in the first place, and then how it would be implemented. That there is this opportunity for those companies. So I would sit down and make that point. I think, but yeah, I think the work is really going to be mostly at the state level to try and get as many countries on board with the idea of an international treaty. So they're sort of parallel tracks.
And with our last couple minutes, since we've exhausted our questions, unless any pop up on my screen here in the next 20 seconds, I just want to get the chance to go around the virtual room and give you all a chance to either finish up with final comments or anything that didn't get brought out earlier, whatever. Sam, I'll start with you.
Yeah, just quickly, I think the key takeaway is we try to work with North American and European institutional investors is to understand that these firms are sort of overwhelmed by the universe of environmental, social, and governance issues. So it really becomes about targeting information's questions that they can use with companies in a very specific way that's theoretically well-grounded, but also is incredibly practical for them. So, for example, and as we've discussed before, we work with Access Now and Business and Human Rights Resource Center to do a human rights due diligence guide on surveillance technologies targeted en masse for investors, as sort of a practical exploration of how investors can play a larger role in advancing corporate accountability. So I did want to selfishly and shamelessly promote that guide.
Fantastic. Colby, are there anything else that you would like to impart to our audience today?
Well, other than just thanking you, Jody, for brilliantly moderating again. I just want to add that I think there are some real opportunities in Congress, both, bipartisan, for work on curbing the revolving door. We saw some activity last year with the State Department and intelligence community, sort of left with the Defense Department. But I'm impressed by all the different groups that are interested in working on these issues. And yeah, I would encourage anybody that's interested in these issues to contact me or my colleagues at Transparency International US. Yeah, thanks again.
And Anna, you get the final word today.
Thank you. Maybe I'll also shamelessly promote a report, which is a paper that we wrote with Amnesty and the Omega Research Foundation on what could be in a torture-free trade treaty. So not the exact language, but the sort of key ideas and how they could be thought through, which includes a couple of sample lists of equipment. So if you're thinking concretely, what does this mean? Hopefully that gives some indication. And also to say thank you to the panelists and to Jeff for putting this together. I think the conversations around how we each related to each other were really helpful to me in thinking through the ways that we're connected in this sort of space that's a bit peripheral to the arms trade, but connected to it and has a sort of set of shared challenges. So I've really appreciated the opportunity to be part of that conversation. And like Colby would say, if anyone is interested in being involved in any of the work that I've talked about, please do feel free to reach out to me. My email address is institutionally very easy to find. So get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.
I too would like to thank the Forum on Arms Trade today, to the Stimson Center for being our host and for setting this up, for allowing us to talk about the arms trade that people don't normally talk about or even usually think about the arms trade. Hopefully this is a small part in in expanding these conversations and the narratives and the links between the different groups that work on these issues. I turn the time back over to Jeff if he has anything, and otherwise I thank everybody for their attention today and encourage you to come to Forum on Arms Trade discussion.